So now that we've talked about uh, what a first responder is, and we've talked about what stress is, let's look at how stress impacts human beings to have an understanding of how it can go awry. You're all familiar with the ACEs research. Um, the ACEs research identified a definitive link between childhood stress, the acuity of childhood stress, the chronicity of childhood stress, and adult health issues. So, just in brief, and there is a reading on ACEs. So if you're not as familiar with ACEs, the reading will help. But as the ACE scores, and ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Events, as the ACE scores increase, so do risk-taking behaviors increase, and so do physical illnesses as the child ages uh, increase. So ACE going up is an increase in stress. You have an increase in risk-taking behaviors and physical illness. It's important to understand that stress can continue to affect human beings after the stressful event. What happens is that hormones in the body, as we talked about before, engage. Sometimes with continued acute stress, repetitive acute stress, or ongoing chronic stress, the hormones don't turn on and off quite as well as they're supposed to. They may even become stuck on, where the hormones are at uh, a higher level, where the body begins to feel as though it's under continual stress, as opposed to stress to certain reactions. Um, and so that's one of the, we know that in childhood that's one of the outcomes of toxic stress in childhood, but we also know that for adults, adults can experience the same type of reactions to continual stress. Um, when we respond to stress, what that is we are assessing the danger of the particular events and our needed response to that. A human's cognitive assessment of the danger is what delineates whether we believe that to be a life-threatening event or merely an event that causes us some level of distress. And it affects the depth of your physiologic response. So as lethality goes up, your response should be, in a normal situation, your response will be greater because your life is in danger. It prepares you to, as I said before, it prepares you to run or it prepares you to fight, but it prepares you to protect yourself. And that's really at the core what stress is all about, is human beings protecting themselves. So what are some of the physical responses to stress? Well, it's what we've talked about. There's muscle tension, rapid breathing, increased heart rate, blood flow is diverted from the organs to the muscles so that you can run away or so that you can fight. Um, but as I just said a second ago, as the body is continually subjected to stress, the hormones can be chronically elevated. In other words, the stress response doesn't turn on and off the way it's intended to. It stays in an on state, which in and of itself increases physiologic stress because you're always at a higher state of alert. And it can, in some cases, cause a deteriorating cycle where you're at a higher stress, so you feel more stressed, and then your stress increases again. So it can be a spiral that spirals out of control. When human beings cope with stress, there's a wide range of ways that we cope with stress. And think about this for yourself. How do you deal with stress? When you're under financial stress, relationship stress, school stress, how do you deal with it? It's a very important conversation to think about so that you can start to understand and identify ways that you normally, and assuming that these things end up working out, um, then you've dealt with them and the stress in an adaptive way. Um, So things like you may have anxiety, you may become angry, and anger is one of those ones that can be on the continuum somewhere, but you may use humor. You may joke a lot to deal with your stress. That's a very common way to alleviate pressure or alleviate stress, as people refer to it. You may go out with friends. You may just avoid whatever the stress is for a while. If it's a paper, you may put the paper away and come back to it later. Those can all be adaptive. But I think as you can see, they do fall on a continuum between adaptive and maladaptive. So how does that work? Well, anxiety as an example. Anxiety can be adaptive because it's you feel anxious, you realize something's going on, you deal with it. But anxiety unchecked may get in the way of you finishing a task. So in school we call it paralysis by analysis. That's essentially anxiety. You are so anxious about doing a good job that you continually analyze and analyze and overanalyze, and eventually you can never complete a project because you're too busy analyzing constantly. That's anxiety. That's how it falls on a continuum. Um, Same thing with substance use. You go out for drinks with a friend, have a drink or two. That can be adaptive. You go out and get drunk constantly. Obviously, that's maladaptive. Same thing with anger. Sometimes lashing out, well, it's not truly adaptive. It's not going to harm anything in the long term. But if you're continually angry, it begins to affect your relationships. It affects your abilities at work. So all of these stress and coping mechanisms fall along a wide continuum, and they're as varied as humans. So again, think about what your coping skills are and talk about them in the discussion board. How do you cope with stress? You're under a lot of stress now in grad school. How is it that you're coping with that? And are those coping skills adaptive for you? Do they work for you? Do they get you to the end where you can complete your work? That's really what coping is all about, is enable you to continue your daily life and the expectations of your daily life. Um, but cultures respond differently to stress. In fact, what is a stressor in one culture may not be a stressor in another culture. Whether you have the latest and greatest car, whether you have the biggest house, is for many Americans a very significant stressor. But if you live in Fiji or you live in, pick another country, uh, whether you have the biggest house or the newest car may not be a stressor, may not be important in your culture because people live communally and share things. So that's not a stress for you. But a stress for you, maybe finding an appropriate mate and having a child to continue your heritage. Each culture has different stresses and responds to their stress differently. So expectation, and there's a reading on some of these cultural differences. There, it views cultural differences in America, so it's somewhat skewed, but it does look at cultural differences. But it leads to varying amounts of stress. It Many cultures will utilize community support, whereas even in America, some Americans, some cultures, I think of my background as Irish, we don't tend to use outside the family support. We may use family support, but we Irish are typically known for not talking about their feelings, not talking about things. But other cultures, I think of the Hispanic culture, which is very much into community support and talking about what the stressors are as a way to alleviate the stress. So different cultures experience and respond and cope with stresses very, very differently. And again, these can all be adaptive responses. Uh, it just depends on whether they allow you to continue um, functioning in a way that you expect to be able to function on a daily basis. Much like there are cultural differences, there are clear gender differences in the way men and women cope with stress. And these are meant to be generalizations, so they are very broad. But men tend to internalize stress. Women tend to externalize stress. So what does that mean? Men pretend it's not there. Men deny the stress. Men become more absorbed in their work or their projects. Um, Men often are more likely to turn to alcohol or substances as a way to internalize, to deny, and to push away the stress that they're having a hard time dealing with. Men are taught from a young age not to share, not to talk about the stress because it's seen as a sign of weakness, typically in men. Uh, Women tend to externalize. What does that mean? Women tend to turn to peers for support, turn to their spouse for support, turn to family, turn to friends. Uh, the women generally prefer to talk about the stress as a way to alleviate and plan to get beyond the stress and to be able to give and receive emotional support as a way to help share and to alleviate the stress. Again, these are generalizations, but they're important generalizations as we continue to talk about through the rest of the course about first responders. So men tend to internalize, women tend to externalize generally. You'll always find men who are much more open and emotional. You'll find women who are much more reserved. But generally, the genders have very different responses to stress. And there are a couple of readings about how this in research has been borne out in the readings for this week. So stress, is called many things, and it shows itself in many ways. It's called pressure. It's often seen as sadness or headaches or frustration or depression or anxiety, pain, migraines. It all depends on the depth and the chronicity of the stress and how it is that people are coping. The more effectively we're able to cope with a stressor, the less we will experience any of these symptoms, and the less time we'll experience any of these symptoms for. So that's how, so now we've talked about what stress is, how stress impacts people, how stress can move from adaptive coping to maladaptive coping, depending on the depth of the stress and the chronicity of the stress. And we're setting ourselves up now to begin in the next module to start looking at the peculiarities of first responders when it comes to stress. So thank you, and I'll see you in the discussion board and in the next module.